Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I wish it was under better circumstances because it's 9:30 in the morning, but I'm about to go in. So I'm going to start by, I'm going to take the assumption that not all of you are familiar with my journey, and I'm not going to do it because of my massive ego. I'm mainly going to do it because my personal journey mirrors the shifts that have occurred within media landscape more generally. So back in 2017, I was finishing my PhD at Oxford, and I was very involved with my ISOC, and we had recognized as an Islamic society at Oxford that there was indeed a very serious problem with the media narrative around us Muslims. And so we took a proactive approach to that, which had multiple strands to it. One was an internal strand, which involved organizing events within the university setting that essentially leveraged the cachet of the Oxford scene to elevate the premise of the discourse that Muslims were engaged in. And so some of you may have remembered the Rethinking Islamic Reform event that we organized back, I think it was in 2016 with Hamza Yusuf and Professor Tariq Ramadan at the time, which was a very big event. And so that was one of many internal events that we were having, which was about trying to get us as a community to think very proactively about how what guidance Islam can provide to us in very concrete ways for the reality before us. What today would be considered to be Islamism. And I welcome your pushback on that when we get to the Q&A. I call myself an Islamist with pride. My PhD was on Islamism, the notion that politics and Islam very much have something to say about one another, and I make no excuses for that position, but feel free to jump back when we get into the Q&A. The other strand of it was to essentially reach out to the media very proactively and say, hey, we saw your really bleak program on this, and we thought you could use, maybe some common sense within that conversation. Here's a really smart Muslim that we think you should put forward. And systematically, they chose the white Muslim, which was, of course, myself. We had a lot of internal conversations around that. Are we reinforcing notions of whiteness by putting me forward? At the time, I was wearing hijab, so it helped a little bit, or not. I don't know. Make your own mind up on that one. We decided that as a strategy, given the levels of tension and hostility that we were facing, that there was some value to having, a white Muslim in the public sphere. So hence my foray into things like BBC Question Time and Sunday morning, Big Questions, The Moral Maze, of which I was promptly excluded as soon as I raised issues of Islamophobia, but that's another story we can get into another time. So that was my beginning of sort of participating in public debates around Islam and Muslims, countering, as it were, the narrative, trying to push back. And for those of you who can remember that far, it seemed really bleak back then. We were being invited on to talk about, whether Islam says you can beat your wife, or, whether or not, Islam said that, apostates should be killed. And so we all thought it was really, really bleak. But I now look back on that on the golden times. And I say that because wouldn't it be even great today to have a discussion on mainstream, aka legacy TV, in which a diverse range of Muslims were actually debating a set of issues? That is done. It's been done for a hot minute. We are completely erased from the public sphere, and I, came up, as it were, in a public sphere where I had a range of Muslims that I could look up to who were participants in the public arena and who represented a multiplicity of positions within that. So, we had the Salma Yaqub and the Respect Party on the sort of left, and we would have the Mehdi Hassans in the, I'm going to call him centrist, I hope you don't mind, Mehdi. And then we would have, someone like Saida Varsi on the conservative right. And so, there was a kind of sense that Muslims looked different and sounded different and could have very different positions on many different issues. That's now gone. You're allowed to bake, but don't talk. No shade, Nadia. None, genuinely none. And so, I come out of that scene, and I was then asked to participate in various documentaries. So I began, presenting and making documentaries, initially presenting, which was essentially the use of my Muslimness as a vehicle for other people's messaging. I very promptly decided that that wasn't going to last. So I got into filmmaking myself, meaning producing the content that I was also going to be presenting, and now that's a rule for me. I don't present anything that I don't also produce, because you're not going to put words in my mouth. And so I then started producing documentaries, both for the BBC, Channel 4. I made some series for TRT World, Al Jazeera on various topics, and eventually realized that the scene that I was in was one in which we were not being actively engaged on issues that were of genuine interest to public debate. We were being used as dancing monkeys. And I stand by that position today. I still think we are largely used as dancing monkeys, and I don't dance for no man. So that's not going to happen either. So where I am at today is that I then founded my own production company called MPWR Productions. The goal of MPWR Productions was to enter the media scene as equals, as it were, as engaged participants as any other production company, although we could get into why that's never going to be the case, because there are always 800-pound gorillas in the room. But at least in terms of creating our own narratives. And so within that, I produced my first film, which you were talking about, which I also directed, which was called Finding Allah, and which was what I call the story of the other victims of ISIS. And Finding Allah was very much about narrative change, in the sense that it was about a time where we were being constantly and still are associated with extremism. Islam was kind of almost synonymous, and still is, with riskiness, danger. Too much Islam was kind of something that we should be wary of. And I was aware from within the community that actually there were very devout families whose not particularly devout children had suddenly decided to pick up and leave and go and fight in a CIA-backed war in Syria. So what I did was I decided to make a film about the family of one of the main attackers involved in the 2015 attack on the Bataclan. I don't know if, of course, you probably remember it. And the idea was to showcase how this family had done everything really right. To be honest with you, they had, they took away their son's passport. They went to the police. They went to the Met. They tried everything they could, and somehow his passport was still returned to him. And despite being identified as a risk, he was allowed to leave the country, which of course must be their fault. Don't know how that happened. Magically happened for loads of young men and a few young women. Many questions to ask and raise around that period still. So the narrative that I was confronted with, and still was confronted with, and now we'll get back to where we are today, was that the only premise upon which we could be asked to participate in public discussions was in order to essentially be the whipping boy for the issue of the day. And there was no real advancing of the issues. And actually, even the internal dialogue that I was observing within the networks, hence my hint at the moral maze, was that when I raised issues, so for example, I have a PhD on Islamic political movements, I have a master's in Middle East politics, I have taught the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, I would systematically be invited onto programs to answer highly reified points about my Muslimness. And when I raised this as itself a form of Islamophobia, hello, more than just a walking symbol for your prejudice, I was disinvited subsequently from the Moral Maze and other programs. Today, I no longer regard those as aspirational spaces. I am with the majority of people under 40 who no longer watch legacy media, who don't take it seriously, who don't afford it much in the way of credibility, and who have moved into the alternative spaces, which also have their own issues, and we'll get into that in just a second. Today, the reality of the media landscape is that most young people are getting their news from YouTube, TikTok, a little bit of Instagram, and some Snap. And Discord, actually, is also a good place that people are also organizing. If you haven't heard of those platforms, do let me know. So let me now go into kind of the shift that I've observed in the narrative war itself. So we obviously started out as many of you will remember, with the whole clash of civilizations, right? That was when I was studying for my PhD, that was the big one. Then we moved into like, Muslims are inherently a problem because Muslim values are not British values, whatever British values are. And then we have now moved into, it's not enough that Muslim values should be British values. You're trying to take over the country, the Great Replacement, actually whatever version of Islam you practice, you are a threat to the numeric majority of this country, which is essentially, you know, a far-right narrative started by someone in my home country in France, Renaud Camus, literally a far-right Looney Tune. And it's now completely normalized. It's something we hear increasingly being verbalized by mainstream politicians, and in fact, by, in all likelihood, the future Prime Minister of this country, Nigel Farage. The main topics that we see being discussed are around the idea of grooming gangs, the idea of Muslim communities being a threat, rapists, terrorists. Muslim is conflated with immigrants, which is conflated with brown, which is conflated with, you know, a threat to white identity. And that is all now normalized in a way that it was not, I have to be absolutely crystal clear, when I was participating in these debates 10, 15 years ago. That isn't to say some people didn't have those views, but they were not normalized. They would have been considered fringe, shocking, a little bit out there. They are no longer out there. So the real threat that we do represent, and we do represent a threat, but in the best possible way, is obviously in the fact that we have a community of believers that are united by a set of ideals that transcend the localized or national imposition of transient political ideals. We have ideals that kind of stand time, that it doesn't matter which way the government wavers, there are certain principles that we will not waver on. That is highly problematic for a political system that needs compliance from you. So we are a threat because we won't comply. We're also a threat because of the connection that we have to the global south. In other words, many people in this room will have family in other parts of the world. What affects them affects you, affects us. As an ummah, we are not just bound by the national territory. We care about people beyond us, and that is why the Palestine issue in particular has been so profoundly threatening to the government, because it's this realization that there is a big contingent of people, not just us, by the way, obviously, who have these bonds of solidarity that means they will not stand by when injustice is occurring. The next one that I would point to is that we believe, and I will permit myself this statement, that injustice should not be something we stand by idly while it happens. We have a history in our faith of standing up against injustice, and where necessary, doing so by any means necessary. And I think that's something to be celebrated, but of course, those in power will not. So where is all of this narrative about us coming from? Is it reality? Is it that there's a small portion of us whose behaviors are being inflated and we're all paying the price? I think that's what for a long time as a community we were sort of taking on. We kind of were like, oh God, maybe there are a few kind of not great people and we have to sort of try and make amends for them. Of course, there are a few bad people in every community. Do we have to make amends for them? Absolutely not. I think when you start to study the roots of where the current narrative is coming from, it is pumped by millions of dollars being pumped into right-wing think tanks, by pro-Israel groups in this country who have every intention of conflating Muslim with terrorism, because that allows them to represent Israel as the front line of a civilizational struggle against the ultimate terrorist other. They are, as we've heard Netanyahu and other pro-Israel people in this country even say, they are our defense forces in the region, right? So that conflation is absolutely critical to this government's foreign policy position and to America's foreign policy position, which of course we are just lackeys to ultimately. There is a reason why we are where we are today, and that's because if the government, if America says look left, we look left immediately without question. We don't even, well, let's look right actually. If only it were look left. Sorry, I'm trying to speed through, I'm aware of time. So, interestingly, let's talk a little bit about where the impact of that narrative is occurring. So the impact of that narrative is occurring on multiple fronts. It's occurring, obviously, it's being felt by all of us, I think, even those of us who are not visibly Muslim, like myself. You know, I'm the least affected in many ways, but I even feel it. And that's obviously the attacks on mosques, it's the attacks on Muslim individuals, but it's more generally a sense that actually talking about our faith, talking about our ideals, talking about the way that our ideals might inform how we move in the world is problematic, it's dangerous, and it can have consequences for our livelihood and even for our freedom, right? There are people who are losing their freedom for statements, they're losing their livelihood for, you know, in some cases, drawings. If you don't know what I'm referring to, they're like, you know, illustrators on Palestine who've had their houses raided at 7 in the morning in front of their children. So the issue to me is that the disappearance of Muslims from our screens has occurred simultaneously with a massive push towards this reified narrative around who we are. And the problem with that is that not only do we not have the people in place within the public arena to be able to push back against them, but that there is a confluence between the interests of a margin, or what used to be the margin on the far right, and now the mainstream political discourse, which is in support of the Israeli position in particular and the Trump administration and wider US administration. The other issue we have now is that there has been a massive shift, as you may have noticed, in the media landscape, right? So you probably will have seen the rise of Talk TV, you've seen the rise of GB News. I don't know how much you know about the people behind these things, but you know, legacy media is basically run by like a handful of right-wing people with political agendas. And this is occurring at the same time as a really massive call to defund public broadcasting. So many of you in this room will probably be really angry with the BBC because of the absolutely disgraceful coverage on Palestine. However, you know, just a show of hands, has anyone cancelled their TV license? Okay, a few of you. So I'm aware that there is a moment in which there is now a convergence of interest between those of us who are really angry with the BBC for that coverage and those who want to do away with public broadcasting. And so I'm going to probably counterintuitively for many of you put forward a defense of public broadcasting right now. When you lose public, sorry? Keep it brief. Yes, when you, well, in the context of this conversation, in the context of public broadcasting, in the context of broadcasting more generally, if you lose public broadcasting, however poor it is, all you are left is with multi-millionaires with their clear agendas. And that's what we have today. So we have the Paul Marshalls with GB News. We have obviously the Murdoch empire, which is still behind, you know, they have a revenue share in Piers Morgan's show, so make no illusions. They're also moving into other spheres, including the YouTube space. And of course, we've just seen Viscount Rothermere, who is the same person who owns the Daily Mail, now having bought the Telegraph. So there's a real sort of convergence of the legacy media spaces into the hands of very few people. And just to point out that both the Telegraph and the Mail have been boosting coverage of the Reform Party. So to give you a sense of what we're up against in terms of the legacy media space. Then we have the new media space, which I have now moved into with my show, The Tea with Myriam François. Please do subscribe on YouTube. I'm not just saying that. If you want to see new media succeed, you have to back it. We don't have multi-millionaire backers behind us. We do rely on people like you just clicking subscribe or becoming patrons for it to work. And this is what we are up against within that space. Many of you will have seen the buyout of TikTok. So TikTok, of course, which was regarded as having radicalized a whole generation, mashallah, was a fantastic space for a long time because it really did allow for open conversations about things, and it did indeed lead to an awakening among many people. TikTok's now been bought out by Oracle, as you will no doubt be aware. If you're not aware of who Oracle are, then you should at least look up what Oracle means, and you will find that it's part of a wider panopticon of surveillance and control that's linked to the rising authoritarianism that we're involved with in today. Paramount, bought out by David Ellison, who then put in Barry Weiss. If you remember who Barry Weiss is, she's the New York Times editor, who of course pushed a lot of the false stories and the pro-Israel lines. Meta platforms, as we know, are facing widespread allegations of systemic censorship of pro-Palestinian content. I myself Won't go into that into too much detail, but experienced massive shadow banning on my own channel. We know that in April 2025, there was a leak that showed that Meta had complied with 94% of Israel's takedown requests. 94% of Israel's takedown requests of content on Meta were complied with. YouTube, which is a space that we're all moving into with glee. Oh, yay, we'll have freedom in YouTube. Well, YouTube is owned by who? YouTube is owned by Google, which, of course, by a recent report shows is complicit in the genocide in Gaza. That was in Francesca Albanese's report, looking at the ways in which various companies that we use day to day are all participants in the genocide. And if you remember, they were also essentially proactively supporting Project Nimbus, which was a $1.2 billion contract, which is about exercising essentially surveillance and facial recognition technologies in the context of Palestine, which are now being wielded out on each and every one of you. Make no mistake.
Minute and a half, Myriam.
Sorry?
Minute and a half.
Okay, so that takes me into where the counter-narrative is being pushed within those spaces. Who's familiar here with the Daily Wire? Ben Shapiro, yeah, okay. So the Daily Wire, funded to the tune of millions of dollars for the first 5 years of its existence, making a loss. But they didn't mind. It's okay. You can lose a few $100 million for us, no problem. As long as you get out the message that we need you to get out, you go do your thing, Ben. And today we know that the Daily Wire makes revenues in excess of $100 million from 2022. They have just secured, several $1 million in seed funding. That was their initial seed funding from an Australian multi-billionaire, a very far-right guy. And they have essentially cultivated the thought leaders of tomorrow. So if you go on YouTube today, many of the people that you think are like just organically like really popular amongst people, like I just don't really get why people love these guys. Yeah, there's millions being pumped into their content. It costs money to produce content. This is not an organic space. It is a tightly controlled, highly funded political space. And we have done nothing in it. Alongside this, all of this picture is the centralization of power towards a tech surveillance authoritarian state. The AI drive that we're going through right now is speeding that up. When I tell you that the levels of freedom and democracy that you think you live in today, you will not recognize them, mark my words, within the next 3 to 5 years. The freedoms you take for granted today are on the line, and I cannot be more alarmist than I am being right now. It is literally an emergency. We are in a situation where the direction of travel is one in which your social media content is being, this is not speculation, there are reports on this, is being centralized. It is then being cross-examined with other data, where you've been, who you speak to, what you do publicly, and then that is creating dossiers for people who are on the front line and perceived as being troublemakers. And those people are then being increasingly pressed. Their houses are being raided, they're having problems in all kinds of sectors, from banking to employment, not to mention obviously the criminalization and the active attempts to imprison people on the basis of tweets, for example. I could go into those laws, but we don't have time. If you don't believe me, just look at the latest Amnesty International report screaming about the direction of travel in which this country is headed. Within all of this, young people now, as I said, watching less legacy media. One of the problems that we have within the news space that I'm also working in through my company is this is a space that is highly polarized. So many of you probably are lovely people, but may watch Piers Morgan. And so you have absorbed the notion that a good debate is a polarized debate. And that polarization is now reflected within our culture. If two people are not fighting to the death, it's boring. Whereas in real life, as we said when we started our company, well, hold on, I sit down in my living room on a Saturday night with some mates and we disagree vehemently on loads of things. And then after that, we have a cup of tea and we get on with our lives. And I don't hate them and I don't wish them death. So it is possible to profoundly disagree with people, even today, So polarization was one of our main areas that we wanted to counter. Authenticity is very important to people on the new platforms. That means they like to know who you are. Like, why do you say what you say? Who are you really? What is it that's guiding what you're saying? So you have to share a lot more than legacy platforms would traditionally have you do, which is kind of present this sort of semblance of neutrality, which we all know is BS, particularly in the context of what we've just seen put out on Palestine. So we started out with the idea that we needed to provide accurate information, which was anti-polarization, put forward the notion that women can be smart. I know it's revolutionary to consider this idea, but in the YouTube space, it's increasingly normalized to view women as being idiots. I have a PhD from Oxford. I regularly get called a dumb blonde. Why the hell is this woman talking? Go and make me a sandwich. That is standard commentary on YouTube from men. So guys, there's some work to do. I'm gonna leave that with you.
Please summarize, Myriam, so we can move on.
Yeah, sorry?
Please summarize.
Sure, I'll summarize all of this. Israel has committed millions of dollars to its public campaigns. You all have seen, obviously, Netanyahu leading the sort of influencer meeting where it was all like, you know, we need to do this pushback. There are hundreds of millions of dollars being pumped into narrative control. We are involved in a narrative war. This moment is first and foremost a narrative war. It's a narrative war over who we are. What does it mean to be Muslim? What does Islam mean? What is our place within the society? What is Britain? Where do we fit into this? These are all narrative wars long before they become frontline wars in which people have to pick up arms. And the problem that I identify personally is that for a long time, as a community, we've been very, very good at the charitable arm, right? So you need to rebuild a hospital, we'll put some money behind it. You need a mosque that's been destroyed, we will rebuild it. But let's take Palestine as a very good example today. People today are putting money into rebuilding mosques and hospitals that were destroyed 3 years ago. So unless you want to continue on this insane loop of funding the reconstruction of things that are to be destroyed in a few years, you have to go to the root. And the root is narrative. We need to take control of the narrative. And part of that, to me, just to finalize, is not about being reactive. That isn't to say, they say we're terrorists, so we say, no, 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 we're not terrorists. It's not about saying Islam's extreme. No, 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 it's moderate. It's about actually, and I think this is the prophetic way anyway, internalizing those values in a way that they become manifest in the world around us. And so I'm going to end with the issue of Zohran Mamdani is a good example of this. There'll be many people who will look at Zohran Mamdani, celebrate his win, but fail to recognize that Zohran Mamdani is also the same guy standing with the LGBTQ plus community, standing with trans communities, the same day that he's standing with taxi drivers, for fair wages. He is on the ground with all communities saying, as a Muslim, to me, everyone deserves dignity. Everyone deserves equal rights. Everyone deserves to live in a just society. And so he is essentially not out here preaching anything. When have you ever heard Zohran Mamdani talk about Islam? But believe me, as someone who knows people around him, he absolutely is a committed Muslim who takes those values very seriously. He just embodies them and puts them out in the world. And so I'm a big believer, and I'll end on this, that the narrative pushback we have to be involved in does not actually involve pushing back in a direct way. It's not they push one way and we push the other. It's recognizing that the way that they're pushing is pushing everything in this country in a certain direction, and recognizing that actually there is a hopeful message of unity, better values, fairness, equality that is absolutely central to our faith, and which we can propound without having to lambast people about who we're really not. I'll end it on that. Thank you.
And Myriam's done a lot of my job in terms of laying out the landscape and how this is a war of narratives. But I suppose I'll step back and first tackle the importance and why we need to challenge narratives within the media, even though the majority of younger populations are moving towards social media. The reality is, when you ask the British public what they know about Muslims and Islam, they will say they get it from mainstream media. And their views on us are that over 72% think that Islam is negative, over 50% think it's a threat to us. Over a third believe that there's no-go areas where Sharia law operates, and about 18% believe the white conspiracy, great replacement theory, that Muslims are trying to take over. Now, those views, they are getting predominantly from mainstream media, which are then being amplified by far-right platforms on social media. And what we found that actually a decade ago, the kind of narratives that you now find in mainstream media, you would have only found on the dark corners of the web or on right-wing platforms. So mainstream media is really important, primarily because, I'll call it mainstream media, legacy media, primarily because that's still where politicians, the movers and the shakers, you know, business people, corporations, that's what they still consume, and that's where the influencers are, and therefore there is a need for that platform of various media outlets to be challenged. And that's where Centre for Media Monitoring kind of stepped in, because before 2018, when we set up, there was growing evidence to show that what mainstream media was reporting on Muslims in Islam was contributing to growing hostility and hate crime. And those were the conclusions of Cambridge University research that was done and Leicester University. And we as Muslims knew this was happening. We didn't need that kind of academic evidence to show it. But having worked in the media and knowing that when you are going to engage with the media, you can't go with just one or two reports. You can't just go with generalizations of what we as Muslims feel this is the narrative that you're proponing. You need to go with an evidence base. You need to go with facts. You need to go with stats. And so the real rationale for Centre for Media Monitoring being set up was primarily to create an evidence base with which you can then start engaging with the media. And it's a very long game. I remember when we were starting out and I was asked, what do you think we're going to achieve in 5 years? And I just said, not much. You know, this is a long game we're playing. You're having to change cultures, mindsets, practices, decision-making processes, etc. So we are in it for the long game. But that doesn't mean that we haven't achieved short-term gains as a result of the evidence base. And how we create that evidence base is really by forensically monitoring the media on a daily basis. And we use bespoke search engines, etc., which throw us up everything that is said about Muslims and Islam, online, broadcast, etc. And the kind of revolutionary thing that we've been able to do as a result of hundreds and thousands of bits of analysis that we've done is this past year work with an AI team who have now developed a specific bespoke AI tool for us, which is going to automate our monitoring and analysis, which means we can be a lot more reactive, we can challenge quicker, we can create evidence more quickly. And I suppose I'm going to take on what you said, Thakir, yesterday, that who cares about, you know, PhD studies, academic studies, all these reports that we bring out and all the stats. I think why we need to care about the kind of work that we do is that if you don't have that evidence base, you don't have the stats, you don't actually have a record of what's going on. Therefore, without a record of what's going on, you can't challenge it, not in a forensic way anyway. And so that's why we've kind of pushed, and that's our bread and butter, the analysis and the monitoring. And with that, you know, we have been able to engage. And I think CFMM punches above its weight. We're a very small organization, but there's no other organization that gets into the corridors of power like we do. So, you know, we have meetings with the Director General of the BBC or the ex-Director General of the BBC and the CEO and the Director of News. And the importance of these meetings and conversations, and there's what's said publicly and then what's said behind the scenes and what is agreed and what is not agreed. But the point of these is that the only reason they engage with us is because they do respect us and because we do have this evidence base. So I think in order to shift narratives, I come back to the importance of being able to have that evidence base and then challenging it. So, you know, the engagement is on many levels, whether we do that one-to-one, whether that's through roundtable discussions, panel discussions, etc. And the interesting thing is, even though our reports are attacking these very media institutions, these same media institutions do come onto our public platforms to engage with us and be challenged by us. So why are they doing that? It could be a tick box exercise, we've done that, I think pre-October 7th, from when we set out in 2018 to 2023, we actually felt we were making a shift. There was a culture and an environment that still felt like, okay, people were willing to recognize that there might be some issues that need tackling. Let's have some kind of expertise around what these issues are, and let's slowly, not dramatically, but let's slowly try and shift this. October 7th has changed absolutely everything. And alongside October 7th, what's happened is that the media landscape has changed as well. Myriam's mentioned the arrival of GB News, Talk TV, and this kind of trinity now, and it's more than a trinity, of GB News, Talk TV, The Telegraph, The Times, Spectator, etc., who've all come together along with the Israeli government and the lobby to push a narrative that has always been one of, Islam is a threat, Muslims are terrorists, incompatible values, grooming gangs, which Elon Musk has now decided to wade into, and, no-go zones in Sharia law, etc. What's happened, and as a result of reform and Trump being on the scene, is that it has legitimized not only Islamophobia within mainstream media, it has legitimized a right-wing agenda. And so what we're faced with now, post-October 7th, is, I think, it is a war. It's a war of narratives. And the pressure that organizations are feeling, and off the record, they will tell you that, guys, get your act in order. We're getting this from the Israeli side. You Muslims are just not organized enough. You need to organize yourself, you need to up the pressure, and only then can we kind of, listen to you. Off the record, they'll say that. They'll never publicly admit that, but we know that that is happening. We know it's happened at the BBC, we know it's happened at The Guardian with the editor who used to be pro-Palestinian. She's known, Catherine Viner, to have, in the 70s, 80s, etc., been very pro-Palestinian. She's had pressure. And we saw in the beginning, when we did our analysis, we did an analysis of the whole British media and looked at 1 month's coverage post-October 7th. And across the board, whether it was left-leaning media outlets to right-leaning media outlets, there wasn't a difference in how they approached telling this story. And even the most robust, well-seasoned journalists who knew the area were behaving like Stepford wives. Everybody was following the Israeli narrative. Everybody had this kind of corner that they were pushed into or allowed themselves to be pushed into in order to give the Israeli perspective. So, with our reports, what we found, like with the BBC report, for example, the Israeli perspective was put across 11 times more than the Palestinian perspective. Despite there being 33 times more Palestinian deaths, Israeli coverage got 34% more, or it's the other way around, I always get those two confused. 70% of all emotive terms were used to describe Israeli deaths. This is creating a narrative. The narrative is that Israel has the right to defend itself, Israelis are the victims, and Palestinians, as Myriam has said, Israel is there as the defender of the West against these barbaric Arabs and terrorists, and we as the West, including the media, need to basically put that narrative first, and that's what we've seen over the last few years. What that does is put us on the back foot, and we don't want to be on the back foot. It's not about being reactive and countering constantly, you are this, no, we're not this, right? It is about creating a landscape where Muslims are normalized. So currently when you see Muslims on TV, and we don't see as many anymore, but we are only called upon if there's a terrorist attack or if there's a major crisis, or because there's something that's within Islam, or, you know, they want you to defend that there's no Sharia law or there's no go areas. So we're constantly brought on to defend and be reactive. What we're not doing, and some media outlets do this better than others, and Channel 4 News is particularly good at this, but what we're not seeing is a normalization of Muslims whereby, you know, you're coming on, as Mamdani is, he happens to be Muslim, but he happens to be a hell of a lot of other things. We're not seeing the, you know, spokespeople who are geneticists or astronomers or, you know, the legal experts or the economists, etc. So we are being framed and minimalized and exceptionalized into only representing one particular narrative. We're not multidimensional, we're not nuanced, we're black and white figures, and that's when we're brought on. And even, we were speaking about this yesterday, even when you get the likes of Nadia Hussain, who are on Bake Off, who made a huge impact, and, you know, again, she was primarily a baker, happened to be Muslim, but she had to be packaged in order to be acceptable and in order to further her career. So if you saw, when she was on Bake Off, she wore a black hijab, traditional way of wearing it. Slowly, they had to move her, the PR and the marketing, for her to wear a hijab like I do, but then slightly the hair need to show, and then she had to be packaged in order to be accepted. And if you look at her now and what she has said, her experience has been, and the Islamophobia and what she faced, you know, even somebody who made it as big as her was still put in the framework of these Muslims need to be shaped and formed and controlled and represented in a particular way. How we change that, I think, you know, I don't believe that just recruiting more Muslims into media organizations is going to make a difference. I know, I started out in the last century in 1988, and there were a couple of us at the BBC. Now there's a lot more, but I still don't see a change in the output or the perspectives or the worldviews. So unless numbers equals difference in output, I don't think numbers matter. But then the numbers also only start mattering when you start seeing people, you know, rise and get into decision-making process. And that's not happening. There's very few people who are in those decision-making levels. But I think the media is just part and parcel of a bigger political, economic, social landscape, which will not allow a different narrative about Muslims to be portrayed or engaged with at the moment. And currently, I would say what we saw during Southport and what we've seen this year is just, it's a drop in the ocean. I think things are going to get really bad and dangerous for us. The likes of GB News, which now online has more viewers than Sky News, the likes of Talk TV, the Telegraph and the Times, which in the last few months and year, we've just seen the vitriol that is coming out from establishment, right? And they have connections. We know from the media moguls and what their agenda is, but where we've got to move on the political sphere as well, that is moving far to the right. I think, you know, the importance of Muslims changing the narrative, but not by being reactive. And this is where alternative media and different platforms come into it. And that's where I think Mamdani did a really good job. He owned it, right? He has not produced lengthy, you know, academic pieces of work or gone on normal, he just owned it. He normalized being a Muslim. He didn't exceptionalize himself. He didn't particularly focus on Islamic issues. But as Myriam said, what he's doing is basing his values intrinsically in Islam, but universalizing us. And I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to get out of our kind of little silos of thinking of ourselves as being really small and only able to tackle certain issues. And what Thakir said yesterday is owning our presence, which has been here for centuries. the other thing, I suppose, with our work, because it's very, slow, it takes a long time, the things that we do. So we do, for example, our BBC report, at a crucial moment when the Department for Culture, Sports and Media was questioning the current chair, Samir Shah, Michael Prescott, who leaked the memo about the BBC allegedly being pro-Palestine, which is laughable given the evidence that's there, and Robbie Gibb, who has been specifically very instrumental within the BBC of pushing a pro-Israeli narrative. Our report was able to be used as evidence within that, select committee to challenge what Michael Prescott was saying. So I think there is value in the kind of things that everybody plays a role, and the role is very different. But I think it's then how to be strategic to use this collective body of evidence, the different mediums and ways in which we can engage. And the media is, whatever you call the media, whether it's social media, legacy media, whatever, narratives are the most important weapons of war. And we've seen that with the thick dossier strategy that Israel has in how to convince the Western media of the Israeli narrative. This is a very sophisticated approach to propaganda that they have employed, and we need to up our game. We need to be able to engage on a level and compete on a level that other people are. I haven't gone into some of our 2 minutes. I'll do one other things. In terms of our engagement, obviously we engage with kind of current editors, journalists, etc. But another aspect of our work, which we think is really important, is getting tomorrow's journalists before they get out there. And so we run lectures and masterclasses at all the schools of journalists and all the leading ones from City, Cardiff, Sheffield, etc., Westminster, where we are sharing our evidence base with tomorrow's journalists so that they can be better informed before they go out there. And I do have hope with the younger generation. I do think there will be a shift even with legacy media, that once the older, whiter, middle-class men have been pushed on and the younger generation comes in, there's a different approach, and we've seen that, on social media, but I think there is still hope. It's a difficult road. Changing the media is one of the most difficult things to do. It's very entrenched. It has a modus operandi. It has a cultural framework. It has a political narrative and framework within which it works. But it's one that absolutely needs to be engaged with and challenged. I'll end it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hamid. Myriam, thank you so much. Thank you. 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 T